All right, so we are picking back up in our study of 2 Samuel chapter 2. We left off last week talking about the immediate results after Saul's death and how basically that leaves open the position of king. And while we know that David is God's appointed man to be the next king of Israel, Saul's family doesn't think that way. Abner sets up Saul's son Ishbosheth to be the next king. And as we looked at that map last time, at this point David basically controls his home tribe of Judah, and Ishbosheth, and as we'll see in chapter 3, Abner basically control the rest of Israel. So there's basically, at least for a time period, a civil war that develops in Israel over who's going to be the successor to Saul. And we begin to read about that hostility in the section that we're looking at this morning in verses 12 through 23. I've entitled this section, The Folly of Worldly Pursuits, and I think you see that on at least two different occasions in this section. First of all, what we'll talk about with the actions of Abner, who was Saul's captain in the army. And then we'll talk about how this also applies to a man named Asahel, who was part of David's company. But I want us to begin by looking, first of all, at verses 12 and 13. And Abner the son of Ner and the servants of Ishbosheth the son of Saul went out from Mahanaim to Gibeon. And Joab the son of Zeruiah and the servants of David went out and met together by the pool of Gibeon, and they sat down, the one on the one side of the pool and the other on the other side of the pool. So, this city, Gibeon, is located north of Jerusalem, about 5 miles. So this would have been in the territory at this time of Ishbosheth, where these two armies are going to meet. The city of Gibeon. You remember last time that we talked about how David reached out to the men of Jabesh Gilead, right, to talk about how they should basically, he praised the men of Jabesh Gilead for their support of Saul. And so David reached out to them to commend them, but he also basically said, now it's time to support me because God's appointed me to be the next king of Israel. And some look at that as, David trying to win over their loyalty. Some think that this is what's going on here in verses 12 and 13. That David is going around talking to these different cities within, at this point, Ishbosheth's territory, trying to convince them that he is the next king of Israel. Basically trying to win over their loyalty. And perhaps that's what David is doing here when he goes to Gibeon. Perhaps that's why Abner comes to meet David, because Abner certainly doesn't want to lose more of Saul's territory to David. If you would for a moment, turn in your Bibles to 2 Samuel chapter 21. So I want us to look at verses 1 and 2 about what the writer describes about the Gibeonites here. Now there was a famine in the days of David for 3 years, year after year, and David sought the face of the Lord, and the Lord said, there is blood guilt on Saul and on his house because he put the Gibeonites to death. So the king called the Gibeonites and spoke to them. Now the Gibeonites were not of the people of Israel, but of the remnant of the Amorites. Although the people of Israel had sworn to spare them, Saul had sought to strike them down in his zeal for the people of Israel and Judah. And let's go ahead and read on down through verse 6. So David said to the Gibeonites, what shall I do for you? And how shall I make atonement that you may bless the heritage of the Lord? Now, I will comment, go ahead and say here, you know that the Gibeonites did not like Saul, right? Because of what Saul had done, right? He struck down the Gibeonites despite what God had commanded or despite what the people's will was. So the Gibeonites did not like Saul, and so David comes and he's trying to heal that wound in chapter 21. Right, again, David said in verse 3, "What shall I do for you? How shall I make atonement that you may bless the heritage of the Lord?" And the Gibeonites said to him, "It is not a matter of silver or gold between us and Saul or his house, neither is it for us to put any man to death in Israel." And he said, "What do you say that I shall do for you?" And they said to the king, "The man who consumed us and planned to destroy us, so that we have no place in all the territory of Israel, let 7 of his sons be given to us, so that we may hang them before the Lord at Gibeah of Saul, the chosen of the Lord." And the king said, "I will give them." So you notice here that, right, not only do they not like Saul, but they also kind of want, from what we understand here, they also want retribution against the house of Saul. So when we tie this in back to what we've just read, it makes a whole lot of sense that David goes to the city of Gibeon because they already don't like Saul. And so naturally, they're not going to like Saul's descendants because of what Saul did to them. So perhaps that adds a little bit of context for us about why they're meeting in the city of Gibeon, and perhaps why David and his men have gone, or at least David sends his men here to try to persuade them to recognize David as the king of Israel. But that's a little bit of perhaps context that is presented here. You know that they meet by the pool of Gibeon. I believe Jeremiah refers to this same territory as the great waters of Gibeon. Apparently this was when you think about a pool, you think about a small, you think about like a personal sized pool at somebody's house, but this would have been an area where you would have not only fed not only where your men could drink, but also where your animals could drink. And so a lot of times pools were where people gathered, especially if they were traveling. You might certainly remember, Jesus met the woman of Samaria at Jacob's well because it was a body of water. And perhaps this is outside the city where they gathered together, but what becomes the focus is the events that happen here. So now look at verses 14 and 15, or 14. Let's look at verses 14 through 16. And Abner said to Joab, "Let the young men now arise and play before us." And Joab said, "Let them arise." Then there arose and went over by number 12 of Benjamin, which pertained or belonged to Ishbosheth the son of Saul, and 12 of the servants of David. Right? Keep in mind, Saul's family is of the house of Benjamin. These people are going to be loyal to Saul and his family. Right? So 12 of the servants came to 12 of David's servants go to meet them. And it says, verse 16, that they caught every one his fellow by the head and thrust his sword in his fellow's side, so that they fell down together. Wherefore that place was called Helkath-Azzerim, which is in Gibeon. I should have had Dad read that verse for us, verse 16. Yeah, it is a mouthful. We'll talk about what that word means in a moment. All right, so if you know back verse 14, in the King James Version, it has the word, Abner says, let the young men now arise and play before us. If you got another translation, what do you have for the word play there? Compete. Yeah, that's perhaps a word that to us is a little bit misleading, but we know from the context, verse 16, what happens. But the word play there is not a friendly idea. It's not the picture of two kids playing together. It's not the idea, of friends doing, sort of a friendly activity with one another. That's not the idea at all. Instead, the idea is to compete, not in a sporting event per se, or not in a race per se, but in terms of actual combat. Now, we don't really, I don't think we really, at least I can't really think of anything that would compare to what is going on here in a modern sense. I know, because you think about in terms of fighting or whatever, generally we don't see, you don't see two armies today call out a certain group of men and the other army call out a certain group of men and then they fight each other for a time period. Generally, we don't really see that, but this was a custom of war in the Old Testament, right? You remember again when we talked about David and Goliath, for instance, and Goliath came out to meet David. David went out to meet Goliath, and basically they fought before both armies. That was a custom of the day. That's something that we don't necessarily have today in war. It's a little bit different for us. I know in hockey, for instance, this probably could be the closest thing, at least in my mind, and I could be forgetting something that might be a more obvious example, but sometimes in hockey, if you watch them play, if two teams really don't like each other, there may come a point in a game where an opposing player on both sides just throws their stick and gloves down and they start fighting. And sometimes the teams are watching, the fans are cheering them on, and generally the winner of the fight is, the winner of the fight gets a lot of praise. A lot of times teams look at it as a way to build team morale if your player wins the fight. And this is sort of the same idea that's going on here. Abner and Joab, at this point, are competing against one another, at least because of who they're representing. They're competing for control of Israel. And perhaps this is a way to help inspire their men to have more courage in case there is a later battle, which will indeed happen. But these are military men. That's what the term young men refers to. These are military men. And Abner again suggests that they compete. And Joab says, well, let's let them compete. So think about this idea again of the folly of worldly pursuits. We've talked about how Abner knows that David is going to be the next king. At least he should have, because Saul recognized that. Saul even recognized that. Abner should have recognized that. And to keep this thought in mind as we go forward, but think about how many Israelites would not have lost their lives on this day, not just what's happening in verse 14, but also what happens afterward. Think about how many Israelites would not have lost their lives if Abner and Ishbosheth had just submitted to what God wanted to be the next king of Israel. David commended those Israelites who died in 1 Samuel 31 because they were defending Israel, right? They were defending God's honor. But this case here is a case of unnecessary or needless violence. Because these are all brethren, right? Israel and Judah, they're all part of the same group, the same children of God. There is no need for them to shed each other's blood. They are physically, in that sense, right, by blood, but spiritually they are supposed to be the children of God. They are blood related, not just physically, but also in a spiritual sense. But Abner and Ishbosheth's willingness to not submit to what God wants leads to the death of a lot of innocent Israelites. Now you think about what happens if Abner and Ishbosheth, instead of being focused on retaining Saul's kingdom and retaining their power, think about how much good they could have done for Israel if they just gave up their human pursuits. If they just gave up this pursuit of the kingdom and let David become the king is what God would have appointed. And I think that's a good thing to keep in mind. All right, note verse 15. Right, because these men are competing, they can't let, especially on the case of Abner, because they can't let their ego down. Verse 15, then they arose and passed over by number 12 from Benjamin of Ishbosheth, 12 of the servants of David. So 12 of them are selected. They fight one another, so that by verse 16, the picture here is that each caught his opponent by the head and thrust his sword into his opponent's side, so that they fell down together. The picture here is that all 12 men die in the process. We don't know. I mean, obviously they fought each other. We don't know all the specifics of it, but the picture here is that 24 men have gathered to fight one another, and all 24 men have died. It doesn't prove a lot, right? And that becomes the motivation going forward, possibly, about the later battles we'll see in a moment. But these 24 men have died because Abner and Joab felt that this was a worthwhile pursuit. Now you notice verse 16, therefore they called that place Helkath Hazerim, which, today cities are not often named, well, I guess maybe in some sense, but we don't often think about the meaning behind the names of cities. I know you think about Philadelphia as the city of brotherly love. I know in Mississippi, right, some of our counties, some of our cities are named after Native American names, which have meaning. But the meaning of this word here is it's the city or the battle of two edges. And it represents the fact that both sides equally died here, right? No one wins in this pursuit. And so you again have the picture, innocent men have died as the result of, especially on the case of Abner, pursuing after his own interest in rejecting what God wanted for Israel. Now you think about that sense, you think about the application for us, you think about sometimes whenever we get so caught up in our own worldly pursuits as individuals, whether that's with our jobs or with our hobbies, and we can get so passionate about it, and there's nothing wrong with being passionate about our jobs and what we like to do, but sometimes we can get so passionate with it that we don't see the damage it could do to others. I don't know this from experience, but I've heard this happen. This happens a lot. But I know a lot of times marriages can fall apart because either the husband or the spouse becomes more invested in basically doing what they want in life rather than trying to build up their marriage or strengthen their marriage. They become focused on. They become so focused on what they like to do, they don't think about the fact that they made a commitment to another person that they have to devote and spend time with them. You think about that within a family too, not just the husband and wife relationship, but it's something to think about as parents and grandparents, where we can become so focused in life on perhaps maybe what we want to do, so much so that we neglect to spend time with our kids or our grandkids. And we damage that relationship. We cause a lot of needless pain and neglect because we're not focused on the right things in life. And perhaps that's an idea that ties in here with Abner, who, he's not really thinking about, and perhaps we can add Joab here, but perhaps they're not thinking about these 24 men dying who are supposed to be brothers, essentially, but they're concerned about who's the better between Abner and Joab. And it turns out at the end of the day, as Brother Wayne pointed out, all 24 men died. They couldn't come to a conclusion. Now notice what happens, verse 17 now. It says that the battle was very fierce that day, and Abner and the men of Israel were beaten before the servants of David. And 3 sons of Zeruiah were there, Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. Now Asahel was as swift of foot as a wild gazelle. And Asahel pursued Abner, and he went. And as he went, he turned neither to the right hand nor to the left, of them from following Abner. So because neither side has proven their worth, perhaps what happens, this leads to an ultimate wide-scale battle here, which involves not just these 24 men, it involves all the company that have gathered here. Now we note here that Abner is basically defeated, at least, because he's the one who is going to be on the run. as verse 17 indicates, Abner and the men of Israel, which here that's a reference to Saul's army. David's men would be called the men of Judah. They were beaten before the servants of David. Now this is important, and this is why this note about these three individuals is added in here in verse 18. Right? That there are three sons of Zeruiah: Joab, Abishai, and Asahel. Do we remember who Zeruiah is? Yeah, if you don't remember, this is David's sister. Zeruiah is David's sister. This becomes really important later on, but this is added in here, or this is here to remind us of this. These three men that are involved, and as Asahel's involved, they're all basically David's nephews. And Joab, Abishai, and Asahel, all three of these are brothers. But notice what Asahel does. Now Asahel was as swift of foot as a wild gazelle. In other words, he was a very fast runner, apparently. So much so that he's able to catch up with Abner. Verse 19, again, he pursued Abner. And as he went, he turned neither to the right hand nor to the left from following Abner. What does it mean there to not turn from the right hand nor to the left? Right. He didn't get distracted. He kept on a straight path. He never deviated from what he wanted, which at this point was to take hold of Abner and probably to kill him. Let's go ahead and read the text. So Abner looks behind him and said, "Is it you, Asahel?" And he answered, "It is I." And Abner said to him, "Turn aside to your right hand or to your left, and seize one of the young men and take his spoil." But Asahel would not turn aside from following him. So here's the second example that ties in with this theme about the folly of worldly pursuits. Abner at this point, or Asahel at this point, is so focused on his mission about capturing and potentially killing Abner that he's not going to leave the path that he is on. And that's what Abner asked, right? Abner in verse 21, "Turn aside to your right hand or to your left. Stop pursuing after me. Go after somebody else and take his spoil." But it says that Asahel would not turn aside from following him. Verse 22, Abner said again to Asahel, "Turn aside from following me. Why would I strike you to the ground? How then could I lift up my face to your brother Joab?" But guess what? Asahel refuses to turn aside. Again, verse 23. But he refused to turn aside. Therefore Abner struck him in the stomach with the butt of his spear, so that the spear came out at his back, and he fell there and died where he was. And all who came to the place where Asahel had fallen and died stood still. So there's the picture here of a man that was so focused on one thing, he kind of lost sight of the danger that he was in. Generally, if you're a commander in the army, it's because you're a very good fighter, right? You've proven yourself. Somebody who is a commander in the army is not somebody who's just joined the military. It's not somebody that doesn't have military experience. You have to work your way up to get to that position. And no doubt, Abner, even though he couldn't protect Saul, as we saw back in 1 Samuel, no doubt Abner was a pretty capable fighter. And perhaps he recognized that compared to Asahel. And Abner gives him this warning to Asahel to stop pursuing after him. But guess what? Asahel is so focused on capturing Abner that he forgets that Abner is a very capable military fighter. So much so that, again, verse 23, it says that Abner struck him in the stomach with the butt of his spear, so that the spear came out his back. I think the picture here is that Asahel is actually caught a little bit off guard, perhaps, because instead of Abner flipping around his spear and thrusting him through with the what would have been the very sharp, pointed edge. He instead takes the back of his spear, and perhaps it's sharpened a little bit because it's able, as you note, verse 23, it's able to not only inflict damage on Asahel, but it's also able to go right through his body. So much so that Asahel fell there and died where he was. Think about what would have happened here if Asahel had just stopped pursuing after Abner and listened to the warning that Abner was giving him. Asahel probably would not have died that day. Very well could have been. But Asahel was so focused on his goal that he lost sight of his own personal safety. Spiritually, I think the New Testament talks about that. I think Jesus and the writers of the New Testament talk about that very idea, about being by pursuing worldly things to the extent, not only as we saw with Abner and Joab, you hurt others, but you ultimately hurt yourself spiritually. Again, you think about the parable of the barns, where that man was so consumed with the amount of crops that he had that he could go and tear down his old barns and he could build another. And he was so focused on that in life that he never gave any consideration for his soul. You remember that Jesus in that parable called him, or at least God, I believe God in that parable called him a fool, right? Because he didn't take care of his soul. You think about the rich man and Lazarus. A rich man who lived in a lifestyle of welfare, or in a lifestyle of wealth. He had a purple robe. He had the nicest things in the world. And he enjoyed that part of the life, even though he saw Lazarus sitting at his gate every day and he didn't do anything to help him. You think about the rich man had not been so focused on pursuing what he wanted in life that he would have taken the time to perhaps listen to the warnings that are given in the Old Testament, or at least the commands to help out those that are less fortunate than you. And he didn't. And he suffered spiritually because of that. Who was it that Paul said had departed him because he loved the things of this present world? It was Demas, right? Demas was so focused on the world that he hurt himself spiritually because he left the service of God, helping out Paul. And then as Paul would sum up to Timothy, that the love of money is the root of all evil. And as Paul would say there in that verse, it led many to err from the faith because they were so focused on pursuing what they wanted in life. We have to ask ourselves about what we are pursuing in life. We may not be like Asahel where we're pursuing to kill somebody, but there is a very fine point here where you become so focused on pursuing what you want, you forget about the dangers of it. Not only how it affects you, but also how it can affect, the other individuals that are involved in your life. So much so that Asahel dies, and as verse 23 indicates, all who came to the place where Asahel had fallen and died, that they stood still. Sort of a memorial to this is a spot where people remembered how Asahel had fallen and died. Now you might think that this is where the story ends, but it doesn't. Because if we note back in verse 18, Joab is the brother of Asahel. And because Asahel dies, Joab's going to continue to pursue after Abner. As we'll see in the rest of this verse, or in the rest of this chapter and moving forward, men are going to continue to keep fighting because Joab wants to get retribution for his brother's death. And so Asahel's death not only affected him, but it also affected at least the continued fighting of the men of Israel, something that God had not wanted. Now I'll close with this, but I think about the difference here between Asahel and Abishai. You remember when Abishai was with David, when they went to Saul's camp the second time, Abishai wanted to go and thrust his spear into the body of Saul and to kill Saul. But you remember, David told him not to do that. It's not your right to put your hand against the Lord's anointed. And so David withheld that zeal of Abishai to Abishai's benefit. You think about how this could have changed perhaps if David had been here. or if Asahel had learned from Abishai's mistaken zeal, if he had just withheld his zeal for a time and thought clearly about what he was going to do, if Asahel had learned from what Abishai learned from David, perhaps Asahel, Abishai's brother, doesn't die in this passage. And I think that's a very good point. About learning from mistakes, learning about patience. Asahel was a man that just could not be patient in this situation, and it ultimately led to his downfall, led to the end of his life. With that being said, are there any comments that you would like to add on to what we've discussed this morning?
This is something that Brother Joab is not going to forget.
You're right.
He will not. Somebody kills your brother, you're not going to forget that. Of course, we know the rest of the story later on.
Right. A lot more Israelites are going to die because of this. But that is, again, that's the folly of worldly pursuits. We not only hurt ourselves spiritually, we also can damage the relationship with those that we love and those that are part of our family if we don't learn how to be selfless. With that being said, we'll go ahead and stop here this morning. We'll pick up in verse 24, continuing the conflict between Joab and Abner next week. But again, thank you for your time and thank you for your attention this morning.